Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. Does it all go to starving children to alleviate suffering and improve the life chances of those who have little chance right now? Britain could be rethinking its overseas aid budget, currently the third biggest in the world, with an approach that's less about you over there and more about me. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. From fixing potholes in Pakistan, yes, really, to vaccinations in Vanuatu, the $18 billion bill for Britain each year helps cut global poverty and is also supposed to, quote, work in the national interest. Now there's a suggestion being taken rather seriously that the UK should be looking more after itself than others.
The UK spent $18.3 billion on foreign aid in 2017 and is the third largest donor in the world. But the former UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson argues the UK's aid budget should be spent to advance Britain's political and commercial and diplomatic interests. He was influenced by the report Global Britain, a 21st century vision by the Henry Jackson Society, which suggests the UK Foreign Office should solely control aid spending. Johnson's position has alarmed charities including Oxfam and Save the Children, who say aid is already being diverted away from helping poor countries. The UK Department for International Development is in charge of 74% of the aid budget. This is used to help reduce world poverty, provide clean water and sanitation, while also working in the UK's national interest. If Britain changes its global interests, how would it affect the millions who rely on its aid?
Let's get talking. Joining us at the round table, we have James Rogers, who helped write the report which suggested those big changes. Ross Bailey's here from Islamic Relief UK. Andrew Boff, too, Conservative member of the London Assembly, and Tamsyn Barton, head of the independent body which studies just how effective British aid is. Great to have you all with us. James, I'll come to you first of all. The line that you put in your report, British leaders should think hard about how to use UK influence. Isn't it about helping people?
Well, it is, but it's also about understanding that the world is changing around us. The world in which we lived in the 1990s when we set up the Department for International Development is becoming very different. So back then, countries like the United Kingdom, the US, the European countries were much more influential. So they worked in a much more benign environment. Now, if you look at the environment today, it's becoming increasingly competitive, increasingly volatile. And we need to think about the implications of that and how it affects the delivery of our international development.
It's about helping people.
Well, it is about helping people.
Not just helping Britain, helping others.
But it's about expanding the way in which we understand how we help people and to accommodate those changes that are taking place in the world today, which are, I would argue, very negative.
If your report is accepted, there are various scenarios, but I'll put one down here. $18 billion, I think we quoted there, which is roughly £14 billion. You would slice it up so that instead of 0.7%, which is the £14 billion, 0.5% would be for overseas development aid, 0.2%, which is £4 billion, would be discretionary spend. If you lop £4 billion off the direct aid budget, you're going to damage those projects, surely.
Well, no, that's just one option that we put forward. The other option would be to get changes, to make further changes. And we've already, because we are a development superpower, we've already managed to achieve some changes to the definition of official development assistance. So that would be the other option, to try and enlarge the meaning of that so that other forms of development that go above and beyond simply the alleviation of poverty, which has dramatically declined in the last 20 years, to accommodate other things, to allow us to move forward into a new era where we live under changed world conditions.
Okay, Ross, you see £4 billion disappear from the overseas aid budget. Do you think that will make a difference?
Absolutely. DFID is a global superpower in providing...
Department for International Development.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The department is a global superpower in providing assistance to those who need help around the world. I think that's a badge of pride for the British people. It certainly is for those who support my charity, Islamic Relief. And I think that one of the things we need to be looking at is we are living in a changing world, but there's still incredible extreme poverty. 70% of Malawi's health budget is funded by donors from overseas. You start making cuts to these type for budgets, you directly start shutting hospitals in countries. That's the risk that we're talking about.
You were
here.
talking to me before we came on air about work in Sudan.
Absolutely, yes.
What sort of projects does British aid money help with there?
So Islamic Relief has been in receipt of what's called UK Aid Match, and that's a fantastic scheme that the UK government uses to encourage people to give and really eke out that generosity of people. In Sudan, we've helped things like deliver water points. We've helped farmers look at new farming methods, trying to deal with the effect of climate change. This is money which has been supported by our supporters, and it's been match funded by UK Aid. And that's been an incredibly powerful force. And what we'd be very worried about with some of the changes that have been proposed in the Henry Jackson Society report and in other discourse that's going on right now is a loss of focus on helping those who most need help.
Tamsyn, you identified, let's call you the watchdog, the overseas aid watchdog. You identified that more than £200 million in one particular year was being spent in Pakistan, which is the largest recipient of British aid, was being spent on their roads. Now, I bring that one up. There are examples on your traffic light system, red, green, red, amber, of what is good and what is bad. So give us an example of where you think things have gone wrong, perhaps, with British aid.
Well, I think I should set that in the overall context that our reviews, and we've now done 68 reviews. I think we're covering about £27 billion of aid. And around about 80% of that receives a green, amber or green rating. So that's satisfactory or better. So that's the overall context. But of course, we always find plenty to improve. And it's very rare that we get a full green score. That happened in the case of the violence against women and girls, where the UK is seen as absolutely a world leader. But indeed, there are areas to improve. You mentioned Pakistan roads. As far as I recall, the issue there was that there was delay, which is very common in infrastructure projects. And our review suggested that there should be much more realistic timetables in the first place rather than over-optimistic planning.
May I jump in here?
Of course.
Shouldn't you be saying you shouldn't be spending money in Pakistan on roads? When the Henry Jackson Society, in your report, you say no major military power should be getting this sort of help. Why should we be improving Pakistan's roads?
Well, ultimately, it's more of a policy question. What we focus on is whether aid is effective or not and whether it gets the people who need it. So the context of that aid in Pakistan is that Pakistan is seen as a fragile state. 50% of the DFID budget, the Department for International Development budget, is meant for fragile states because it's considered it will be important for Britain's security as well as global security that fragile state doesn't become more fragile and ultimately lead to conflict. Now, roads, in principle, are a huge contribution. If you look at economic valuation, you will see that that's actually the strongest contribution to economic growth, because with infrastructure, you get trade, you get livelihoods, you get jobs. But as things stand at the moment, then what we're seeing is that the aid managed by the Department for International Development, which has a very long experience of this, is overall more effective than is the case on average for the other government departments. And the Foreign Office, which has less of a track record in this case, is much less transparent about what it does, is on the whole less effective as far as the reviews that we've covered.
So you think the system at the moment is working relatively well, that the suggestions made in James's report might tip the balance the wrong way? Some of them, at least.
That is a risk. It's not necessarily the case, but as things stand, at the moment, actually, we do follow-up reviews each year after we've completed a review to make sure that the improvements sustain. What we're hearing is that there has been some improvement as a result of them taking on board our recommendations in the Conflict, Stability and Security Fund. So we hope that ultimately all British aid from all departments will be at the levels of effectiveness that we would give a green rating to.
Andrew, I'm going to bring you in now. I mentioned potholes in Pakistan. I think, what was it, 37 million has gone for transport in India, which is not only a big military power, but it's also has its own space program. Yes. The argument is that some of the money should be spent back here by those who are critics of our overseas aid program, rather than on other countries. That if you're, we have potholes in this country which can't be fixed because we don't have enough money. Is that a valid argument?
I think the problem is that those people will focus on those few areas that look peculiar in terms of foreign aid in order to justify their argument. Actually, the bulk of foreign aid, as Tamsyn has confirmed, is actually spent very well for the direct alleviation of poverty And you know, it's the British national interest for us to have a peaceful, sustainable, wealthy world. It's in our interest to have that, and therefore it does mean investing in countries that occasionally look like they can look after themselves. Because ultimately, is aid about helping countries, or is it about helping people? And there are some pretty poor people in some quite wealthy countries and those countries themselves perhaps haven't taken the policy decision to be able to help their own poor. And if that means that we have to help them as well, that's something that we will have to do. But we must continually hold our government to account on how it is being spent.
I suggested at the beginning that this was not so much about you, the bigger, wider world. The changes in James's report were perhaps about me. But it has always been thus, hasn't it? That any country spends its money overseas not just to help people, but to help itself.
Yes, but there's the length of vision that one has. There's either the Russian or Chinese way, which is to give aid directly linked to infrastructure projects in Africa. Incidentally, I declare an interest. I'm chair of Africa House London, which promotes investment in Africa from London. Not an aid organisation, may I say. But there you see that chunks of aid being directly attached to investment. May I say that the quality of that infrastructure that has been put into Africa by both China and other places that have taken that approach is not as good as the British stuff.
My question was, hasn't it always been about
self-interest? It's about the long-term self-interest or the short-term self-interest. Are those people who are arguing we should spend it at home actually saying we should be more like Russia? We should be more like the way in which they link their foreign aid objectives to direct political.
Well, let's ask James. I mean, is that what you're suggesting?
Absolutely not. We're not saying that we should take money from the aid budget or the official development assistance budget and spend it at home. What we're saying is that we need to reappraise the way in which we actually do the spending. And I don't think it's...
Do we need to say we'll give you money as long as you buy British
I don't think it's as simple
products?
That's not what we're saying, no. I don't think it's as simple as that, and we've seen in the past cases where that's been very unsuccessful. What we're saying is that we need to reappraise the way in which we give assistance, and we need to reappraise the way that we see international development, because the world is itself changing. So those are the two things, and we don't think it's the case that it's taking from the poorest people in the world to give to wealthier people. We can balance these and prevent the inefficiencies that we've seen in the past and improve other areas that would allow us to have a greater impact.
Are you suggesting that it is almost altruistic and that the side effect would be of benefit to Britain, and we need to work out where best that side effect could come in, rather than it being simply about self-interest?
I'm saying that it's in the long term that we need to look, and I'm thinking here about a 20 or 30 year period into the future, not individual projects or the next 2 years or 3 years, and about depoliticizing the issues surrounding aid, and to understand that we need to integrate it more coherently into our wider national strategy, because that's not necessarily only benefiting us. It's not me. It's also about helping and improving the situation around the wider world. But aid is not by itself the only way through which that can be delivered. It has to be integrated to other components such as peacekeeping, defence, security, official development assistance in other forms as well, foreign direct investment. It's about seeing the whole thing, and the paper argues that we need to see the whole thing more comprehensively than we have in the past.
Okay, let's throw one particular thing up in the air that comes in your report, and that is about money for the BBC World Service. Pretty much everybody who's watching this programme will have heard of, if not heard, the British World Service. One of the things you suggest is that a quarter of the money that has been taken away directly from the aid budget, in this case £1 billion a year, goes to promote the BBC World Service, which you describe as perhaps the most powerful tool of influence on earth. I'll come back to you for the reasons why, but as somebody who knows where the money is spent, what would you think about something like that?
I don't think there's any debate about the power of the BBC. I think the question is whether or not we should be essentially reallocating money from one budget to another budget to make that happen. I do think an interesting example we might talk about are things that aid has done in terms of promoting some of the values that I know are in the report by the Henry Jackson Society about tolerance and about freedom. There was a fantastic programme run by an organisation called the Girl Effect, and it was Yegna, a band in Ethiopia. And that band essentially was pretty much pilloried and cut out by a lot of media criticism back about roughly 3 years ago. This was an extremely highly rated programme that was helping girls and young women in Ethiopia think about their choices and their freedom. If we want to talk about the sort of values that we want to be promoting, we can be doing that through these excellent sorts of programmes. The BBC is a fantastic institution, but we're already using aid.
So it's more than just a radio station, it is a tool of influence. And you think that influence is being promoted correctly? Perhaps?
I think that we have got in projects that DFID, the Department of International Development, and other sort of arms of the UK aid programmes are doing fantastic work. I think that there's absolutely a case about how we look at the role of the BBC, but I don't think that should come at the expense of other projects, and that is the argument that's being made here.
Tamsyn, yeah.
Well, I just thought it was worth mentioning that in 2017 there were, I think it's 25 million was the amount that the BBC got. And that was identified as fitting within the rules of official development assistance under the rules of the Development Assistance Committee, which is part of this think tank, the OECD. That's the kind of generally agreed high standards that everybody aspires to keep to. So over a lot of experience of trying to find the best kind of aid rather than what you've called the Russian or the Chinese style of aid, these rules have been agreed. There are absolutely fabulous ways in which this money can be used, which have been evaluated as effective, such as the BBC Media Action. So you get soap operas promoting AIDS awareness or ending child marriage or whatever. It's a very effective tool for that.
But would you be happy to see the budget increased 40-fold?
I think it would be hard to see how that would be effectively for official development assistance. That would be my question. Because from the point of view of ICAI, as the aid watchdog, we don't want to see high standards diluted. So if it ultimately comes down to more being a projection of British soft power rather than contributing to making a difference on the ground, that's where we'd have doubts about it.
Can I ask you about something called the Grand Bargain?
Yes.
Which Britain is associated with, and anybody, of course, can weigh in on this. I think it's a UN-backed scheme that was launched 4 years ago, et cetera, with a goal of 2020 as being the time at which providing 25% of global humanitarian funding to local and national responders by 2020. How well is that going, and how much of a part is Britain playing in that?
Well, we've just done a review of the UK's humanitarian reform efforts, which did get a green amber score, so that's relatively good. The Grand Bargain was setting a very high standard for everybody. Basically, it was an agreement about how best to help poor people in a sustainable way and in a coordinated way. And one of the areas that you've just pointed to is, unfortunately, the area we're progressing the least. I'm looking at Ross because Islamic Relief is, of course, does important humanitarian work. One of the big challenges has been how can you fund directly locally rather than going through intermediaries? But then in the context of the recent safeguarding crisis, then questions were raised about how much oversight there can be from here. And so that has probably put back the cause of localisation. Anyway, in our report, we were critical of the extent to which the UK had really seriously pursued the localisation agenda. We felt that the UK could have done more. It does more than most by the way that it channels its funding.
Because this is one of the things...
It doesn't use its influence as well as it might.
I wanted to get at. I mean, is the UK... in effect, put in the stocks sometimes unfairly when you look at the amount of money it gives, when you look at the help that it provides, compared to other countries?
Absolutely. What are we arguing about here? We're arguing not
that
they should spend more, that actually we're saying how should it be spent, and that's a perfectly reasonable argument to have. It's a perfectly reasonable objective to look at that 0.7% of expenditure, that £13 billion and £14 billion, and say how best can we spend this, and you know, to take up what we were talking about earlier with, you know, if they did decide to fund the BBC World Service by through the aid budget, that's fine, but it would remove for me any reason for having a license fee in the first place.
Look at the increase there has been.
Every time I have to pay it, and the only reason I don't mind paying.
We're not talking about the BBC licence fee here, but in terms of British aid, there's been a massive increase since 2006, when it was just below £6 billion, and it is now, as we say, £14 billion. Organisations such as yours, Ross, must have seen massive improvements in what's coming to you, no matter how it's allocated within departments.
I don't think organisations like myself, charities, necessarily are the most significant beneficiaries of this, and I think that there's important that we sort of look at where it's coming. What we do see from our experience in country, though, is the power of the Department for International Development. It is in a huge ways. If you go anywhere in Africa, anywhere in Asia, you will often see signs. I was in Kathmandu a while ago, walking through the streets, and I see a sign brought to you by UK aid. If those start disappearing and they start moving to more middle-income countries and they start going on support for trade initiatives or other things that can fit in a definition of soft power, if this is to interpret some of the ideas between the Henry Jackson Society.
No, that's not true. We're not making that argument. Please stop saying that. That's not true. We're saying that because the aid budget will continue to grow, because it's fixed at 0.7% of Britain's gross national income, it is going to continue to get bigger. So it's not a case that we'll be raiding from Peter to pay Paul. As the aid budget gets bigger, we can therefore reallocate certain amounts of money to other projects, other things, which would exist within an expanded definition of international development to account for the changing world environment.
I have to say, at the beginning of your report, you had an introduction, as we saw, from Boris Johnson, perhaps would-be leader of the Conservative Party, that's not for this programme to discuss, who 3 months ago said, just before his party's national conference, that our aid budget shows magnificent disdain for the national priority, and he was the one that headlined your report. Is that what you think is happening at the moment? There is magnificent disdain for the national priorities here?
Well, you should ask him that question.
Well, but you asked him to write the introduction to
I'm saying that the changing world environment means that we need to change the way in which we define international development. There's no point us helping certain regions if behind us countries such as Russia and China are going to come in and cause chaos and pandemonium. Think about Syria, think about Ukraine. What we're saying is that you need to think about this in a broader way to ensure that Britain can have maximum impact across the different levers of power, whether that's international development assistance, whether that's foreign policy, whether that's foreign direct investment, defence, security, and so on and so forth. And we need to reappraise it in that context.
So we come back to the premise of this entire programme, which is about whether you can make the money go further in terms of both national interest and overseas benefits. And I want to quote something from she is in charge of international aid, a minister called Penny Mordaunt. This was January of this year. She goes down to a South Coast company called Polestar Cooling, which makes fridges for vaccines around the world. And she says, from the telephone to the solar fridge, British invention and innovation continues to make a huge difference. Fantastic Brits like those manufacturing these life-saving devices. She's got it right, hasn't she? That, good work is being done, and good work is being done for the Brits. That's the way it should be.
Yeah, but she also argues very strongly that those companies should also play their part in contributing towards foreign aid as well.
Not a bad idea.
It's not a bad idea. We shouldn't be hung up on it always coming from taxpayer resources. What we need to look at is whether or not, as a country, our commitment is up there. And she's done amazing work in her job at DFID, and she's a great advocate for foreign aid. And if anything, she very assertively stands up against those people who say all of foreign aid is wasted and we should be spending it on hospitals in the UK. This is a ridiculous argument, and she has hit it head on.
A lot of it is headline grabbing. Yep. Unfortunate, perhaps, from some of the things that have been written about you, unfortunate perhaps for the way that the conversation has gone. But the important thing is that the conversation is now being had and that in terms of where the money is spent, we should always be having these conversations.
Absolutely, and I think there is space for radical and differing proposals out there, but there's proposals that we could look at in many ways. In 2015, the UK was a proud signatory to the Sustainable Development Goals, and those were a set of goals meant to look at the development of this planet as a whole. If we want to look at radical proposals, how about we look at far better coordination between government departments, looking at what we're doing in the UK and overseas? The Department for International Development already plays some role in coordinating about this. We've talked a lot about the FCO and the
Foreign Commonwealth Office. I always have to spell
Apologies,
these things out
I'm
for
so
those that might
sorry.
not
The
understand.
Foreign Commonwealth Office having a role here.
Yeah.
But we could be looking at far more cross-government. We don't need to look at one department swallowing another
And the
to
important
get greater
thing,
effectiveness.
perhaps, Tamsyn, just to round off the programme with you, is transparency. We need to know where the money's going and why. And you'll
Absolutely.
continue to keep your eyes on that.
Very much so. We're frankly not satisfied at the moment that there's sufficient transparency. If any of you want to go and look at various government department websites, you'll see that only one is fully transparent, and that's the Department for International Development, about where its aid is going. But there are specific standards. The government is committed to meet those standards of adequate transparency by 2020, and we'll be watching and making sure that they do and calling them out if they don't, and that will be picked up by the committee in Parliament to which we report to, and they will hold the Minister to account.
Changes are needed, or changes will always happen?
Well, I think we'll probably need to be increasingly transparent over time as technology allows us to be more so. Ultimately, we could have complete visibility over the aid programme.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for coming on the programme. $1 billion a year for the BBC World Service. What we would give for that sort of budget on this programme, but we've got the best guests anyway for virtually nothing. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for watching. From me, David Foster. Hope to have your company for another Roundtable. Goodbye for now.